Hello and welcome to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. I'm Nick Norbrook. I hope you're doing well. For all our news, analysis and comment, head to theafricareport.com. We have a great collection of articles on Nigeria at 60 and how Ethiopia is opening up to diaspora investment and much more. This week on the pod, William Asiko, the Managing Director of the Rockefeller Foundation for Africa. He's worked for the Kenyan government and spent 20 years with Coca-Cola in various roles across the continent. Now his focus is farming, specifically how the continent can make a step change in both the production and the marketing of its huge agricultural potential. We start with an understanding of the huge hopes being placed in agriculture for its ability to create jobs just at a time when climate change may make that harder.
The urgency around agribusiness and investment in agriculture, whether it be public sector investment or private sector investment, I think has always been there. I think you are correct in saying that indeed the matter today has taken on a new significance because of the twin challenges of the economic crisis that is facing the continent, and certainly around job creation, but also around climate change. In the initial phases, I would say 10 to 20 years ago, the challenge was food security. And if you remember the famine of Ethiopia, which I think was the face of what food insecurity meant in Africa in 1984, food security for the next, I think, 10 to 15, maybe even 20 years after that famine was the principal goal for African governments, policymakers, and stakeholders in the agricultural sector. I think over the last 10 years, and especially since Malabo, there is a realization that the public sector itself is not going to be able to solve the twin challenges of economic development, but also more importantly around agricultural development. And so there was this realization that private sector investment was required. And hence today you have a lot more discussion around agribusiness and private sector investment in agricultural value chains. So yes, the urgency is there. I think the dynamic has changed. Previously, it was around food security, and food security remains important and central. But I think there is a realization now that you can solve the twin challenges of economic development, job creation, as well as climate change with private sector, and the discussion is hence around agribusiness.
The public sector part of that equation seems a very catalytic one and time-bound one. If you look at Japan in the 50s, the government spent a lot of money helping cooperatives to come together and federate, help them with getting letters of export and the financing around that, help with rural infrastructure. What for you have been some examples of success in African governments playing that catalytic role?
So first of all, I think Africa in general, if I can speak about the continent in general, has done a number of very positive things in this space. The first was the passing, I think 14 years ago now, of the Common African Agricultural Development Program, CAADP, by the African Union. This was the first time that Africa as a continent had a common roadmap, if you want, to agricultural development that they all signed up to. And I think, in excess of 48 or 49 countries signed the CAADP Compact, which meant that they agreed to its principles and agreed to abide by the CAADP objectives, which were really to increase investment, both public sector investment and private sector investment in agricultural value chains, but as well as address the twin issues of job creation, increasing smallholder farmer incomes, as well as address food security. So this was a very comprehensive document, and that in itself was positive. I think when you click down now to the next level of individual countries, is where you begin to see the challenges. And yes, there are some countries that have done very well. Let me give you an example. One of the critical components of CAADP was that countries should increase their share of the budget on agriculture to a minimum of 10%. Initially, the amount was 8%. The level was then revised after 10 years of CAADP's implementation to 10%. But if you look at the number of countries that have actually reached that goal, it is less than 10. So although you do have the roadmaps, you do have the intention of creating the right environment for agricultural development and transformation, many countries are struggling to actually get to the levels that they themselves have agreed to under CAADP. So that's the one thing. I think there are some good examples. You look at Rwanda, you look at Ghana, you look at Senegal, Kenya to a certain extent, they have done a number of things that are very, positive in terms of following the guidelines laid down by CAADP. But many countries remain far behind. I think another positive thing that has been done on the continental level has been that the heads of state have agreed to do a biannual review of all the key indicators under CAADP to see how countries are moving forward. This was not done initially. So for the first 10 years of CAADP, they didn't have any mechanism to review countries on an apples by apples comparison, which they today have. And so the biannual review is an African Union initiative, and every 2 years, countries report in on how they're doing on a number of key indicators, including investment in public sector investment through the budget of reaching that 10% goal. So those are some of the positive things. I think the biggest challenges still remain the fact that many African countries continue to rely on rain-fed agriculture. This is subject to drought, this is subject to climate change, and so food security still remains a challenge, but also a lot of land that has the, possibility of coming under irrigation is still relying on rain-fed agriculture. This, to me, remains one of the biggest challenges for African agriculture.
Fixing those kinds of challenges, seem to require, as we were talking about earlier, some kind of, large investments. The sort of the canals that crisscross the Midwest in America were hugely important to irrigate agriculture in the sort of the last half of the previous century and before that, especially. Is there not a failure to engage with that kind of huge, large-scale infrastructure that helps farmers? And are there, new technological shortcuts? I'm thinking of, for example, schemes in India to connect pumps to draw water from under the ground to a simple solar panel, and these solar pumps can now be found, all across India, and I think do a relatively good job. Is there not a case for either continental level, or that does seem rather unwieldy, but at least at national levels, national governments spending a percentage of what they spend on agriculture on really trying to leapfrog to some of these solutions?
That's those are some very, very pertinent questions that many African policymakers, I think, need to really think about how to advance this particular agenda of irrigation. But even though I've identified irrigation as a critical challenge for African agriculture, I think that you've got to take this into context. there are a number of very critical factors that ail African agriculture. And you'll find that in most countries, they have the same challenges. You see, so you have the productivity side, so the production side, the farm level side. And this is where I think irrigation falls. How do we increase the productivity? If you look at what, the productivity is in Europe or let's say peer countries in Latin America, on the same staple crops that we have here in Africa, you'll see there's huge disparities. You know, even in Latin America and Asia, many countries that have, been in emerging economies have got very much higher productivity when it comes to staples like rice, maize, corn. A lot of the staples we have here, we're still very low in productivity. And irrigation is just one of the challenges. We have other challenges like low usage of fertilizers, low soil testing, low usage of quality seeds, and so on. So there's a lot of challenge on the productivity side. Having said that, there is progress. You know, those challenges need to be addressed through policies, through extension, greater mechanization, and investment in infrastructure. So you're right. The other challenge remains, the market side. So you increase the productivity of farmers, but they've got to have to find a way to get their produce to market. And again, this remains a big challenge. Is, when you have rain-fed agriculture, seasonality then is a problem. All the produce gets, a particular region like East Africa, very similar rainfall patterns. The rainfall season, the planting season, the harvest season are more or less the same. And people are planting, many farmers are planting the same crops. Maize being a staple throughout East Africa is quite common. Potatoes, all of these, are ready for harvest around the same time. And because of rain-fed agriculture, this means that the price drops, farmers are disincentivized, they try different things. And so irrigation can solve a lot of these challenges. Now, how does government get to this stage? And you quite rightly say that, there are huge challenges around the level of investments required to get to, a level where irrigation is actually transforming African agriculture. There are definitely technological advancements since the canals that were used in largely in Europe and North America to kick off the irrigation and the agrarian revolutions in those regions. Solar is one of them, as you say. Irrigation equipment, the prices of irrigation equipment have fallen significantly over the years. This is really a challenge that has been addressed in terms of the investment. I think the problem is matching the availability of the technologies and the ability of particularly smallholder farmers to acquire these technologies. That still remains a big challenge. How do you make available technologies on a cooperative basis for 100,000 farmers, smallholder farmers, all farming, less than a half a hectare each, and make those available to them at a price that they can afford, but also in a manner that is sustainable? It's more an area around coordination and extension than perhaps resources. I think there are significant resources available, from multilateral lenders, development finance institutions, and even in government budgets to do this work. The challenge remains the capacity for government to put in place policies, to implement those policies, and to develop cooperative systems that can benefit smallholder farmers. So to me, the challenge is not resources. It's more about how you target your resources, how you bring other actors together to ensure that these technologies that are available, whether it's irrigation, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's seed, can be made available to smallholder farmers on a sustainable basis. To me, that is the biggest challenge that African countries need to solve.
It does sound like, at its heart, this is a coordination problem, as you say, and that traditionally, and I'm sort of state versus market agnostic myself. I think you have to be very pragmatic about these things. But traditionally, where there is a very high level of coordination needed, you do need a sort of either a unitary actor like a state, or possibly a huge corporation to help with all these kind of coordination issues. Would it be fair to say that the countries which you deal with regularly, which have a high level of coordination, such as Rwanda, are the ones which are making more progress in this very tricky issue of helping Africa emerge agriculturally?
Yes and no. So I think that you are absolutely right that this is a challenge of coordination. This is a challenge of coordination, and I think that the different countries are at different stages in terms of their capacity to coordinate and implement policies, and so you do find huge disparities from one country to another in terms of that state capacity and capability to do those things. I am personally a big believer in the free market with certain sort of safety nets to allow for things that particularly affect smallholder farmers, okay? So the coordination, where countries have been successful, let me take a value chain approach rather than a country approach. If you look at a country like Kenya, for example, there are two sectors that have been highly successful, even though the majority of farmers that are farming in those sectors are smallholders, and that's dairy and tea. Dairy and tea are, quite highly successful value chains in Kenya. Majority of farmers in these sectors are actually smallholders. And why is that? They are highly coordinated in the sense that, the milk, let's say it's dairy, milk is organized around cooperatives. It's collected on a daily basis, reaches a lot of private sector involvement in processing. And so today there is only one government dairy processor. All the rest, and there are numerous, are all private sector. And they all have arrangements how they buy their milk. They either contract or they work through cooperatives. And so you have a highly successful sector. Some would say that perhaps, dairy farmers should get paid more for their produce. But again, that's a worldwide problem, and I'm sure you see that in Europe as well. Tea is another very good example. Kenya's tea is almost 100% run by the private sector. You do have a development authority, Kenya Tea Development Authority, which focuses on regulation, extension, and making sure that the practices are sound. But again, you have the tea factories, the processors, largely owned by the smallholder farmers themselves. The tea price is set at a public auction. Again, very little involvement from government. And so the coordination is very effective where the private sector takes a lead. Now, of course, this hasn't worked in all the value chains. There have been other value chains that haven't worked very well in terms of supporting smallholder farmers. And those have largely been around poor policy and government coordination. I don't want to generalize, but I think that the more private sector involvement you have in the coordination mechanism, the more you involve the smallholder farmers in the ownership of the processing, the more sustainable your coordination mechanisms are going to be, and the better prices that farmers are going to have for their produce. And this has been shown to work in countries that have had agrarian revolutions, Japan, Vietnam, all these countries that have had, agrarian revolutions in the last century have had a high level of private sector involvement in the value chain, but very strong policies effectively implemented by government, as you say, as the large overall coordinator that makes sure that everybody is playing fair.
They also had big fertilizer subsidies as well. Is that something that you want to see more of?
Yes, I think that the truth of the matter is there is no country that has developed its agriculture Um, excuse me, I'm just get a glass of water here. Sorry. If you look at the countries that have successfully developed their agricultural sectors, subsidies of one form or another have been critical to that process. And I don't think that Africa is going to be any different. I think Africa has got to find a way to effectively use subsidies. I think the challenge is what we see in Africa is how to effectively implement subsidies, especially for inputs, to ensure that these subsidies actually go to the right farmers. The farmers get them in the right amounts, in the right quantities at the right time. It all comes back to state capability and capacity. If the subsidy is being managed 100% by the state, you will find that there will be leakages and there will be inefficiencies. If the state partners with the private sector to provide subsidies, to provide other inputs, to provide inputs that the government then subsidizes by paying directly to the private sector or other players, works with development organizations to help provide these subsidies, I think you'll find a more sustainable way of delivering these. Now, subsidies should be used tactically. I don't think that they should be a permanent state of affairs. That's, again, another challenge that you find. And again, it's a challenge you find in many, I would say, mature economies as well, where subsidies continue to be used in certain value chains because governments have an interest in maintaining either the farmers who are producing those products, or they want to maintain a stake in the world economy on that particular product. So there are many political reasons why subsidies continue to be. But if your subsidy is about agricultural transformation, it certainly should have a time limit. It should have a time frame. It should not be permanent, because at the end of the day, you do want farmers to get to a stage where they are producing, breaking even, and increasing their incomes.
How do you judge Nigeria's attempts to subsidize and indeed protect the rice producers in the country?
Yeah, look, it's difficult to speak about a country's personal circumstances because there are a lot of different reasons that motivate decisions that are made, especially around something that's highly sensitive as subsidy or indeed a protection of particular sectors. However, the fact of the matter is that Nigeria is still today not self-sufficient in rice, all right? It still is a net importer of rice to meet the demand in the country. This is a scenario throughout West Africa and a lot of the rice staple countries in West Africa. They're still net importers of rice, which is a tragedy given the fact that they do have the land, they do have the technology, they do have the farmers who could produce. Each of these countries, I know at least 5 countries today in West Africa that could be self-sufficient in rice. Now, the path to getting to self-sufficiency will require the fact that the government has to take a sterner position on protecting the fledgling domestic rice growing industry. They have to find ways to ensure that the farmers, have the land, they have the infrastructure, they have the processing capability, and some of that will require subsidies in inputs. Some of those will require making investments in processing, making investments in roads, infrastructure, electricity to ensure that the processors are where the farmers are, extension to ensure that farmers are using the best practices, the best seeds, the best inputs that they require. And yes, there is going to be some requirement for protection against imports. And so I see all these levers as being essential for a Nigeria or a Senegal or a Ghana or a Cote d'Ivoire, these rice staple countries. I see that there's definitely going to be a need for some level of protection for some time to ensure that the farmers who are starting up can get to the productivity levels, can produce at a competitive quality at a competitive price before you allow them to compete with imports.
Does the because there's been a lot of enthusiasm around the African Continental Free Trade Area, does this this necessity that you outline of helping national producers reach a certain level before you can open up, does it make the African Free Trade Area perhaps a little premature?
No, I think the time is absolutely right for the African Continental Free Trade Area, and I'm really pleased that a lot of countries have taken this positively, and there's it got to ratification very quickly. That the 28 countries required to ratify, it was reached in record time, and it's well on its way to being a treaty that is going to be at the stage of implementation fairly quickly. Now, it's always a balance with free trade. What is right to protect, what is right to allow for free trade. But for me, the challenge that that Africa faces is not one of protection. It is more one of increasing intra-Africa trade. Today, African countries are importing finished products, raw materials from outside of Africa that are available in Africa. And it's an even bigger tragedy that in many cases, African countries are exporting unprocessed, whether it be minerals or agricultural produce that are processed outside of Africa and imported back into Africa at a huge cost to the economies of African countries. So I think, to me, the African Continental Free Trade Area has gonna have many, many more benefits for African countries before you even get to the stage of thinking about whether to protect, one sector like rice or maize or another. There is so much potential. We are still importing too many finished goods, processed agricultural produce that can be processed in Africa and can be sold to neighboring countries. If we just get the policies right, we put in place the right infrastructure that will allow the cost to come down and be and effectively compete with the price of what is imported. So my answer to your question is, it's going to be a balance, but we still have so much scope for so many other products before we even get to the question of protecting fledgling industries. I think the challenge for Africa is to say, we need to get competitive with the world. And the only way we're going to get competitive with the world is if we start trading with each other, which will give scale and which will allow the quality of what we produce and what we process to go up and its price to come down. And at that stage, we will be ready to compete with the rest of the world.
Why is it then that, or perhaps that is exactly the reason, that Africa does not have a big agribusiness company along the lines of a Brazil Foods from Brazil, which does so much to import frozen chicken into South African markets? Why is it that Africa still doesn't really see the emergence of such big corporate titans in the agribusiness sphere?
Yeah, look, I think Africa lags behind in that space in producing big corporates of any sector, but agribusiness in particular. I think the challenge that we have is that people tend to see Africa as one anomalous entity, when it in fact is not. It's 54 different countries with numerous different regions, with different languages, different currencies, and different policies. And the Africa Free Continental Trade Area is one way to address that. A lot of the protocols that are being passed by the African Union and the various regional economic communities like the East Africa region, ECOWAS, SADC, is an attempt to deal with those things and create one anomalous market that can then be an incentive to create big companies that have a large domestic market. So we have a lot to do in order to get there. If you look at Brazil, you look at India, you look at China, some of these big producers that are able to produce and sell abroad and land a lot of their produce into African countries at very low prices. These are single countries that have huge domestic markets. They developed their domestic markets first before they were able to compete effectively internationally. And that's what Africa must do. And that's where the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is going to play a big role, is that we must develop our domestic markets. We must become competitive in our domestic markets. We must develop quality that is worldwide in our domestic markets and then begin to compete internationally. And so, my answer to your question is, yes, we do need these big companies. They will be very effective in making us competitive at a price and quality that is competitive with anything else in the world. But we need to align our policies so that there is an incentive for a big domestic company to establish itself and see itself as having a big enough market in Africa to invest, to make the necessary investments to become these conglomerates and compete with these big companies in Brazil, Australia, and other countries that really do export a lot of good quality products into Africa at competitive prices.
At the other end, from the blue chip corporate stratosphere, there are small agribusiness companies which could, I suppose, if you listen to the most optimistic voices, have a real opportunity to start exporting by using the new e-commerce platforms that are now so widely available. We saw the transformation that occurred in China when various villages got themselves onto Chinese e-commerce platforms and started doing the marketing and the product creation and selling into the big consumer markets around Shenzhen, around Beijing, Shanghai, etc. To do that, it does seem that many African small agribusiness ventures would need to take a quantum step up in terms of packaging and marketing skills. And yet it does seem a very seductive vision that a village in Senegal could target specialty groundnut buyers in Brooklyn with some nice packaging, some nice history about the origin of the groundnut in this particular area, and sell to high-end consumers in a very localized market in the US. Is that a picture that you can see? And if so, what do we need to do to get there?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think you do see a very limited number of small producers that are already doing that, particularly in the coffee space. I think groundnuts have been mentioned. There are a couple of others as well, and I'm sure that number is growing. But is it going to be transformational in Africa? It will take time. African business people, African domestic investors, particularly SMEs, still have huge hurdles. They have huge hurdles to overcome in terms of getting businesses off the ground. Hurdles that are as a result partly of poor policies or poor policy choices, but also governments that are not working or pro domestic investors, but also challenges that are structural. Access to finance remains one of the biggest challenges for SMEs. in our work here at the Rockefeller Foundation, we get, hundreds of proposals from very entrepreneurial young people who would set up, I think remarkable companies, but getting access to commercial finance to get their enterprises off the ground, those kind of specialist institutions to do that just do not exist. You have a few pockets of success. You have small microfinance institutions, but these are not going to be transformational. I think we in Africa have to crack this issue of access to finance by SMEs and smallholder farmers to be able to get them to a level where they can succeed and compete effectively on international markets. So that's definitely one of them. The second thing that we have to overcome is just the idea of policy. I mean, if it's so difficult for a small company that wants to export its coffee, its groundnuts, or any other commodity that is produced in agriculture and processed here to a neighboring country, how are they going to compete internationally? How are they going to be able? And some of the challenges that they have in getting their produce to a neighboring country are structural challenges, a lack of infrastructure, non-tariff barriers at borders. That these are all things that are within the purview of government to solve. And so there's that issue of coordination again, that issue of, domestic investor-friendly policies that are implemented effectively to support this kind of thing. All these things will have to be addressed. Otherwise, you'll continue to have these one-offs where you have one small company in Senegal or in Ghana or in Kenya that is doing well with, I've heard stories of honey being exported to the EU, flowers, you have a lot of horticulture that's being exported to the EU out of here. Those have been very successful. But are they transforming African agriculture? No. Until we solve these structural challenges of the ability for smallholder farmers, small businesses to trade with neighboring countries, to trade regionally, it's going to be very tough for them to become big and trade internationally. There are a lot of good and positive things happening on the continent around agriculture. There are some countries that have got very good stories to tell. But you will see that these countries that are doing well on the agricultural front, I'll call them out, the Rwandas, the Ethiopias, Ghana, Senegal, you will find that they're the same countries that are doing well in other sectors as well. So there is no doubt in my mind that the role of government is critical to achieving success in any sort of economic transformation, and more so in agricultural transformation. There is a huge role for the public sector to play. That coordination role, that public sector investment role, that infrastructure role, that policy role, those things are critical. The private sector alone, farmers alone, the civil society alone are not going to make that leap to transformation without government.
That's all for this week. Our thanks to William Asiko. If you want a compact 5-bullet fix of our analysis, news and comment each day in your mailbox with some extra context on top, head to theafricareport.com and sign up to our newsletter. If you enjoy these conversations, go straight to iTunes and give us your love on the ratings. I'm Nick Norbrook. Thanks for listening.